And also like there's a bunch of like American ultra leftist types basically have like spent the last few weeks trying to like prove that this protest movement is incurably racist, and just to prove a point about when you see white people in the streets.
That racism thing is just so interesting though, because it's like there is a new popular movement of the people. The people in France is conservative and racist, so obviously there is going to be racism and homophobia and other things in that movement. And for the first time, that really really fascinates the media, who usually never ever talk about it. But what is even more, I don't know, puzzling for me is the fact that now in Paris, I'm really, really struggling to convince my comrades that we need to, we need to be with the gilets jaunes. And many of them, they tell me, yeah, but listen, there was 0.29 and 0.30 of the people's directives that were not great on migration. I think they're quite reactionary on this. And I was like, okay, but the committee, yes, it's not perfect. And yes, we don't agree with all of the people's directives, that's for sure. But the Comité Justice pour Adama, which is one of the main forces of the anti-racist decolonial left in France today, is joining and is really voicing very much its support for the movement. And we, the white left, are going to say, no, let's wait and see if they clarify that 0.29 in the people.
Yeah, and that guarantees that it goes over to the right.
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly.
Welcome back to Alpha Bunga Bunga, the global politics podcast at the end of history. What comes next? Well, mass, angry, leaderless protest movements that reject traditional parties of the left and the right. This is what we're seeing in France with the gilets jaunes, or the yellow vest protests. That Macron was unpopular, we knew. That France was dissatisfied with the way things were heading, we also knew. But that there was this profound exasperation, we maybe did not. It's caught France by surprise, and the gilets jaunes movement only seems to grow. The violence on the streets of Paris last Saturday, the 2nd of December, made global headlines. Macron since rolled back on the fuel tax that kicked off the protests in the first place. But as we'll learn, there's a lot more to the gilets jaunes than that. So to talk us all through this, we're really happy to have Aurélie Dianara join us. Aurélie is a research associate in international economic history at the University of Glasgow, and a feminist activist who sits on the National Committee of Potere al Popolo in Italy. She's the author of an article that came out in Jacobin last week called We're With the Rebels, which, for my money, is one of the best things written in English so far on the yellow vests. How far will this inchoate protest movement go? Is Macron's government at risk? Might even the Fifth Republic be at stake? All of this right now. Welcome everyone, I'm Alex Hochuli. I'm joined by Ben Fogel, who's in New York right now. Hi Ben.
Hey.
And we are very happy to welcome Aurélie Dianara to talk about the Gilets jaunes. So let's get cracking. This is a very fast-moving development, which is expanding day by day. A lot of this is provisional, but at the same time, we're going to try to draw out as much as we can and see what we can learn from this. The protest started in the middle of November, and it started in reaction to a carbon tax on petrol and diesel, but it's, as everyone knows, has expanded well beyond that. But I think it's probably best if we begin at the beginning. So, Aurélie, what are the Gilets jaunes' demands, at least in their kernel from the start? Is it a consumer or a tax protest? Would you characterize it like that?
Right from the start, or initially, the Gilets jaunes are people that no one had ever seen mobilizing before, people who decided to mobilize at the beginning of November because of the increase in fuel prices. Basically, the initial reason why they started to organize is because the prices of both diesel and petrol have been increasing a lot this year in France, because of the general increase in the price of the oil barrel, but also because at a few weeks before the movement started, the French government announced that there would be a new increase in fuel prices by January 1st, 2019, which they presented as a carbon tax that was supposed to partly finance a sort of ecologically oriented energy transition. Obviously, this news was taken pretty badly by a part of the France that has to make a lot of that live mainly in the rural and in the peripheral areas of France, in small towns and rural areas, and that has to use their car a lot to make a lot of kilometers every day, and on which basically fuel prices cut a lot into their incomes. So that was the initial reason why the Gilets jaunes started to organize. They started to organize on social media. On Facebook and on other media, and they decided to wear this yellow vest, this fluorescent yellow vest, and so they decided that they were going to make themselves visible by wearing this vest and by blocking roads. Basically, they organized roadblocks everywhere in France, thousands of roadblocks on the 17th of November, and so I guess you could say that initially in the first phase it was tax protest against this increase in fuel, but then very, very quickly it became something else. I guess this something else is something we're going to explore now.
Indeed. I think the interesting thing is that some of the commentary, because the demands were initially framed around tax, treated them as a sort of conservative movement, a sort of petty bourgeois conservative rural movement, which just didn't want to be taxed as much. But if you actually look at their demands, it seems to be more progressive than that. They really say tax the rich instead. Stop taxing the small guy. I think maybe it might be worth considering this in the context of Macron's changes to tax law, which have really been upwardly redistributive. So the way he abolished the wealth tax, for example, right?
Yes, absolutely. So what appeared quite quickly since the 17th of November, when all the journalists, all the media were basically going everywhere to interview those mysterious yellow vests, the gilets jaunes, to understand what did they want and how did they think and who were they, you know. It was the question that everybody was asking themselves, and so everybody, all these gilets jaunes were saying something that was quite striking. It was that it wasn't just about the increase in fuel price, and that the increase in fuel price was in French, la goutte d'eau qui fait déborder le vase, which means, the straw that breaks the camel's back, apparently. And that actually, it was a much more profound sense of exasperation and despair and anger against a series of policies, fiscal and social policies, that have been implemented by Macron's government, the current government, but also by previous governments, and that have basically had, as a result, the outcome of these policies have been to increase the largest fortunes in France and to really decrease the living conditions and the incomes of the popular classes and the middle classes in France.
Just to expand on this, in terms of another framing of these protests, there's a question of regional inequality. It tends to be normally when people think of inequality these days, particularly in advanced capitalist countries, they think of the sort of periphery of cities and the center of cities. But this seems to be illustrating a sort of rural and urban divide, with Macron symbolizing urban France and these guys being the forgotten guys of rural France. Can you expand a bit on that?
Yes, so it seems, I guess sociologists will tell us more in the next months and years about exactly where the yellow vests come from. But it seems that they come mainly from the rural areas and from basically the small towns, not so much from the peripheries of large towns, but from the small towns where a lot of people also have been forced to go back. In the past years, there's been a movement of people going back to live in more rural, peripheral areas where rents are lower, where the price of life is lower, but where the living conditions have been made more and more complicated in the past years because of all the cuts in public expenses, because of the of the closing of railway stations, of transport, all kinds of public transports, post offices, hospitals. Any access to healthcare has been made more difficult in the past years in these areas. Schools, nurseries, basically all kinds of public services have been made more difficult by the policies carried out by different governments in the past years. And this added to the fact that those people have to travel a lot to go to work, and that the price of the fuel has been increasing. This makes the living conditions of the populations of these peripheral France more and more difficult to sustain.
I think we want to get on to talking about what those demands are, because last week there was the protesters issued a list of 42 demands, which it might be worth exploring that in a little bit more depth. I just wanted to comment firstly just on the rural and the peripheral France aspect of the protests, which is, at least to me, this seems one of the first protests of the so-called left behinds about which there's been a lot of talk over the past 2-3 years, but which is a protest which started in the peripheries and the small towns, and that hasn't taken an electoral form, because one can trace elements of that to, the vote for Brexit, some of the element of the vote for Trump, even maybe some of the protest voting for Le Pen. Do you think that's a feature of this, the fact that it actually started in these places rather than starting, a big call for a protest in the center of a city?
Well, I guess that's what makes the movement both quite unique, and also maybe that is one of the reasons why the movement has been looked with such mistrust and such confusion by everybody in France. Basically, the large majority of the population who live in large urban centers, the media, obviously, and the political class who probably to some extent are now completely disconnected to that part of France, that a part of France that has become, or that has probably always been quite invisible in the public debate, in the public sphere. And also, I guess also connected to the French history, there is this idea that any sort of popular uprising that comes from the rural areas is intrinsically conservative and reactionary, going back to the French Revolution. So this might be one of the reasons why this protest, this movement, well, first of all, no one saw it coming. It took everybody by surprise. And it took so long for everybody basically to try to understand it and try to decide whether to support it or not. And still today, basically, a lot of people, including large parts of the left, are still hesitating and are not sure whether to support that movement.
Well, indeed. I mean, their demands are, according to some study done by Le Monde, 2/3 of the demands match up to the radical left of Mélenchon, for example. About just under half of them match up to the presidential campaigns of Le Pen or Dupont-Aignan in the last presidential election, and very little with the center and the center right of Macron and Fillon. So there is it's ambiguous, it's very broad based, but the bulk of the demands are around inequality and would tend at least towards the left. And yet the gilets jaunes seem to reject political parties. It's a rejection, perhaps even of representation. I mean, I guess I want to phrase that as a question. It's such a broad-based movement with pulling in so many demands as it seems to grow that it doesn't seem to be immediately co-optable by existing political forces.
To comment on this, you need to rewind a little bit and explain how the movement sort of evolved from the start. So initially it was just this quite spontaneous movement organized on social media about the increase of fuel prices. The movement has then expanded from the 17th of November, when there was almost 300,000 people in the streets everywhere in France. The movement has been resisting and has been very resilient, despite very, very strong repression that we have seen on TV, that we have seen both in Paris and in the province. And the movement continued to basically organize mainly on social media. People are talking and using these sort of like Facebook tools to sort of organize their claims, their demands. they have elected last week, Monday last week, they decided to choose 8 national communicants. That's the word that was used. They're basically delegates that were supposed to establish a link with the government in order to bring the demands of the gilets jaunes to the government. Then almost immediately the actual legitimacy, the representativity of these 8 people has been very much subject to discussions and very a lot of tensions within the movement, internal to the movement. In fact, those delegates, they never really met the government. I mean, there was some failed attempt for a meeting, but actually what happened is most of the delegates they gave up and they renounced to meeting the government because they received apparently a lot of pressure from within the movement against establishing this kind of contact with the government. And then in the meantime, a series of claims have been formulated. The Gilets jaunes have released a number of documents. The most important of these documents was this sort of press release that was released last Thursday, and that was sent both to the government and to French MPs, in which the Gilets jaunes were basically establishing a list of 40 people's directives. That's the expression they used, that were clearly going much beyond fuel questions and even tax questions, and that were raising questions of equality, questions of implementing a much more progressive taxation system, implementing rent controls, prohibiting relocations and posted workers, for creating more open-ended contracts, so abolishing or sort of impeding precarious works, abolishing the CICE, which is a sort of like tax cuts and tax exemption program that is transferring billions and billions of euros each year to employers, including big multinational companies in France. There were other claims for investing in sustainable transport, for implementing a maximum salary, and also claims about stopping immediately this closing of rail lines, schools, nurseries, hospitals, etc. So, as you said, if you taken as a while those 40 people's directives, they are closer to directives or to the program, if you wish, of the France Insoumise, or anyway of the demands of a left-wing force, than of anything that the Républicains, the conservative right, or even the Rassemblement National ever put forward. This said, it does not mean that we can be sure, as of now, that the movement is taking a left turn. Everything remains to be seen. In fact, Marine Le Pen, the leader of the Rassemblement National, the ex-Front National, is actively trying to sort of surf on the wave of the movement. It remains largely unclear if she will manage to do this. A lot of sectors of the left, including institutional parties like France Insoumise, as you said, which was one of the first important forces of the left to support the movement, a lot of the trade unions are now very much organizing to support the movement. There is important forces on the left, on the anti-racist political left in France, such as the Comité Justice pour Adama, that has expressed their support for the movement. And so there is more and more a sense that an important part of the left has become aware that there was something very important going on, something very important at stake, and that it was their responsibility to sort of be in that movement, to try and avoid that it would be sort of recuperated by the extreme right. And so to go back to your question, the movement proclaimed itself as an apolitical movement from the start. which doesn't mean that they don't want people who are affiliated to parties or trade unions to be with them in the roadblocks or in the demonstrations. In fact, they have expressed the fact that they are open and they want any force who is willing to support them to come and to join them, but they just don't want anyone to appropriate the movement. They don't want anyone to sort of try to determine the movement. To basically, they don't accept parties to come with their flags or their colors. They want everybody to wear the same yellow color. So it's not as clear that this movement is anti-political, in the sense that I think they do reject leadership, political leadership, and I'm not sure about this, but I would bet that most Yellow Vests hate Marine Le Pen as much as they hate Macron and they hate Mélenchon, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, the breadth and the amplitude and even the acceleration of the movement has been really fascinating to observe. And I think we want to come back to some of these organizational questions and what they might mean going forward in a little bit. But I think first we should talk about Macron, which Ben wanted to come in on.
When Macron was elected a few years ago, he portrayed a year ago, really, he portrayed himself as a sort of fresh young modernizer, the new face of Europe, the new face of France, the sort of radical center. And at least, I don't think quite in France, he wasn't ever that popular, but at least in terms of sort of the Anglosphere of liberals, he was seen as the great hope. But this specific moment seems to have catalyzed all the anti-Macron energy into these protests. Can you talk a bit about like Macron's standing right now? What's been going wrong with his presidency? Is he on the edge? Where's his project going?
So indeed, I think it was almost exactly a year and a half ago that he took office, and he did present himself initially as this modern president that was neither right nor left, and that was just a progressive president against the extremes. One of the reasons he was elected is that he presented himself in the second round of the elections as the antidote to the extreme of Marine Le Pen. I think it came across. It became clear quite quickly after he took office that this was a massive fraud. That the neither left or right was actually completely extreme center right, and in general, even for people who don't refer to these categories anymore of left and right, the result of the policy that Macron has been implementing, that he was already implementing in the previous government that he was part of, the result of these neoliberal policies basically has been rising poverty, decreasing incomes in the popular classes and in the middle classes, increasing difficulty to make it to the end of the month in larger and larger strands of the population, because when you listen to every single day, you turn on the radio and you listen to the testimonies of the people in the street, what most of them just say is, after the 15th of the month, I don't have food in my fridge anymore. I have 2 kids, and I have to ask my mother, who's a retiree and who is herself on social benefits, to give me money to feed my kids. I mean, there is little mystery on what's going on and who's speaking. And I think it has become very clear quite quickly that Macron was the president of the rich. And that's really the image that has been coming out in the following months after he was elected, that he was the president of the rich, that he was very arrogant. He's been saying, he's been making a few statements, different statements that really showed his class contempt for his own people, which I think is probably one of the main difference between Macron and his predecessors, because probably Hollande and Sarkozy were carrying basically the same policies as he did, but they were at least pretending still to be connected to their people and to respect their people. Whereas Macron, the young president that was presenting himself as the president that spoke really frankly. What he was doing basically was showing his arrogance and his contempt for the people. And that was really one of these straws that broke the camel's back, basically, because people realized that the government and the president were not in any way connected to their reality.
And it's interesting that arrogance of Macron, of just basically ignoring the people, it makes the symbolic force of the yellow vest all that more evocative, because it does seem to be saying, pay attention to us. We have all these disgruntlements, all these demands, all these frustrations, which are all being kind of compiled in a almost sort of ad hoc fashion or on the go. The plane is being built as it's flown, but it does seem to really strike at Macron's arrogance. That's the main unifying force. And yet it seems also that this is in some ways a rejection of neoliberalism. I wanted to talk a little bit about this in terms of the context of the past 20 years of French history. I think neoliberalism in France has come in a much more drip feed fashion, I think, compared to, for example, what happened in the UK. And part of the reason, I guess, is that there have been a sequence of mobilizations against it by different sectors here and there. So neoliberalism has come in a bit more slowly. Would you agree with that characterization?
Yes, I guess, although I think in the past years, and especially since the crisis, we have seen a number of reforms, privatizations, tax cuts, a series of policy sets that can very well characterize as neoliberal policies, and that were implemented both by the quote-unquote left of the Parti Socialiste during Hollande's presidency, and by Macron now, and by Sarkozy and Chirac before them. And I think it is true that in France we did see a possibility, like a capacity for mobilization that was perhaps stronger than in other countries, even just in the past 2 years, at the end of Hollande's presidency and at the beginning of Macron's presidency, there's been mass protest movements and mobilization in France. 2 years ago, against the labor law that Hollande was passing, that was basically dismantling the labor rights of the workers in France. There's been a huge movement that lasted for months that became very massive, but very violent as well. That came at the same time as this Nuit debout movement, which was also a very new type of movement for France. I mean, it was sort of similar to some things that had been seen in New York with Occupy Wall Street, or in Spain with the Indignados movement. But in France, it was the first time that happened, and it lasted for over 3 months until the summer came, and then the whole movement basically sort of died.
Just for clarification, how would you compare Nuit debout to the gilets jaunes? I mean, was it younger, perhaps, more urban?
Can you, before you go into that, you have to expand for non-Francophile readers what you specifically talking about these protests?
So the Nuit debout, so Up All Night movement was a movement that was started in March 2016, if I remember well. At the beginning of this sort of like citizen and workers movement against the reform of the labor law that Hollande was pushing, and basically it was encouraged by a number of intellectual figures from the left who organized this occupation of the main square in Paris, La Place de la République, which is a very symbolic square for France and in French Republican history. And the idea was that we were going to occupy that square and to stay all night until this the law would be dropped by the government. But then it became a much wider movement, a very interesting movement where people were trying to keep the square every night. Maybe they were evacuated by the police, but they would come back every morning and build all sorts of committees about different teams, trying to sort of organize a new sort of democracy from below, basically.
But it's interesting that the Gilets jaunes seems to be much more broad-based and brought in larger sections of the working class than Nuit Debout did.
Yes, so that's the thing. The Nuit Debout was very much an urban. It wasn't only Parisian. It happened in other large cities. I think it happened in Marseille, probably in Lyon, Toulouse, Bordeaux. But it was very much intellectual, middle class. A lot of teachers, students, people who worked in the public sector. As officials and educators, whereas the gilets jaunes today are a completely different composition of the movement. They're much more workers, they have different profiles. There are precarious workers, part-time workers, people who are retirees, younger and older workers, unemployed, people who have been inactive for many years, but also small businessmen, as we mentioned before. So it's a very different composition of the movement than Nuit Debout used to be. The question is whether today it will be possible to make those two strands of the French movement meet on common claims, and because at the end of the day, as I was trying to explain at the beginning, it is the same thing that those different movements that have been popping in France in the past years are fighting against. It's basically those neoliberal policies that the different governments have been implementing in at least the past 10 years. But
I just want to come in here again. So I think one of the things that's been very apparent, and I've been trawling through the at least Anglophone coverage of these protests over the last few days, is kind of this sentiment from sort of establishment voices. The one, I cannot pronounce her surname, but she is The Guardian's main columnist on France. She's a former Le Monde editor, so she's and her entire take on this is that Macron represents a European renaissance that all people who believe in democracy have to defend against the sort of barbarous movement that is just this unrefined anger, the politics of anger that gives rise to populism. And I think that take has been repeated in the US as well. And there's sort of this urge to see that any sort of spontaneous anger is just populism and is some sort of disease that's spreading that makes us like Brexit or Trump's vote or Bolsonaro's vote. So is there a sense that how is the sort of like center voices behind Macron responding to this? Is there a sort of mainstream media section behind Macron, or is there more divisions about this protest in the media coverage there?
Yeah, so, and it's the same thing that has been happening in Italy as well. I mean, generally the center, the neoliberal bloc has been presenting itself increasingly as the solution, the progressive solution against the sort of nationalist, extreme populists from both right and left. And this is obviously a very twisted and a very dangerous putting things in my opinion. Right now, the reaction has been quite diverse in French in the French political class and in the media. Basically, initially, all the oppositions were sort of using sort of trying to instrumentalize this movement to raise their attacks against Macron, whereas the government and the majority, La République En Marche, were standing with Macron. But very quickly, basically, it appeared that even within the majority, so even within Macron's own movement party, there was a lot of divisions appearing on the gilets jaunes, because in the first phase, until basically 2 days ago, Macron was determined to insist on his reforms. What he was saying is that, oh yes, he or mainly his spokesperson, would repeat that they hear the despair of the people, but that they wouldn't be able to change policy because this was the right thing to do to bring France to a modern era of the wonderful startup nation that we're building thanks to Macron. So initially, that was the line, but many people, even in Macron's party, started to think, well, maybe we should listen a little bit more. Maybe we should consider this, suspending that new carbon tax. Maybe we should consider actually reestablishing the solidarity wealth tax that Macron suppressed when he took office. Maybe we need to consider raising the minimum salary in France. So right now, actually, the president's majority is very divided. Even the media, I mean, the main media outlet, seem to have adopted a view that probably the government needs to wake up, and that probably it has been almost 3 weeks now since the movement has started. The government's reaction has clearly been inadapted because the movement has been increasing in size and in violence, and so I think Macron and I think actually the government is in a very, very difficult position right now, because they have been losing consent even within their own camp.
The situation seems remarkably open only 18 months into Macron's presidency, and I think the next steps for the gilets jaunes, they're going to have another demonstration this Saturday. The following Saturday, I think the CGT, the Trade Union Confederation, has called its members out, that's my understanding. So it seems to be its plans to continue going and continue growing. So I guess as a way of concluding this, where do you see this going? What happens next? Do you think Macron's government is under threat? Do you think, even because I think this has been mooted by Mélenchon, for example, to establish the Sixth French Republic, that the Fifth Republic might be even under threat by this?
It's very difficult to answer this question. As I said at the beginning, every day there is a new series of surprises, of announcements that make it very difficult to have an analysis and to sort of foresee what's going to happen. Right now, I think Saturday is going to be decisive. What is going to happen Saturday will probably determine the following of the movement, because on one side, the government has started since yesterday to sort of give up a number of reforms and of measures that they had announced. They announced that they would suspend this carbon tax. Now they are announcing that they will start a wide consultation about the solidarity wealth tax. They are not doing a U-turn, because those things that they are giving up are actually very small and only temporary concessions, and it's very unclear if the movement that has radicalized a lot and that has much wider demands by now, it's very unclear if how the movement is going to respond. It's very unclear if they are going to listen to the interior minister and the government, who are calling everybody basically right now to not take to the streets on Saturday, and who are already announcing that there will be even more police forces in Paris next Saturday than there was last Saturday, which has seen levels of repression that we haven't seen in France in many years. It was at the insurrection, and the level of repression last Saturday was very scary for many people. So right now, the trade unions have started to show increasing support. Both the CGT and FO, which are two of the main unions, at least the transport sections of these unions, have announced that as of Sunday, they were starting an unlimited strike. Another branch of the CGT, the public services of the CGT, has announced it would start on Saturday, a 22-day strike. Tomorrow morning, there is a meeting between the leaders of the 5 main confederal trade unions and other rank and file grassroots trade unions that are going to meet as well and decide what to do. And this is something that hasn't happened in many years. I think probably since the start of the 2008 crisis, that all the trade unions are meeting in order to decide whether to adopt joint measures. So anything could happen in the next days. It's very unclear. Hopefully, what my hope is that the left will be able to organize, to be with the movement, to be in the squares, on the streets, with the yellow vest, with the gilets jaunes, in order to take their responsibility to try and help that movement to go towards a progressive and anti-racist direction.
Well, it's a fascinating and very dynamic situation, and we're all watching. You've been great. That was fascinating, Aurélie. Thank you for talking to us, and we'll have to have you back on if and when this continues going forward. So right now, Ben and I are going to discuss some of the more generalizable themes about these sorts of protests that have emerged basically everywhere in the decade since the 2008 crisis. But before that, I just wanted to welcome all our new listeners. If you like these sorts of discussions on the crises of our times, we do a lot of this stuff. So please subscribe, follow us on Twitter and Facebook, and tell your friends. Lots of you have also been getting in touch, suggesting topics that need to be covered. Stuff like the legacy of postmodernism and whether there's anything to be salvaged from it, or the Nigerian elections coming up in February. We'll be doing both in the new year. So do get in touch, even if you just want to say that we're ignorant morons and why haven't we covered the shit that's going down in Ruritania or the hot new social theory that explains fucking everything. Get in touch. We'd like to hear from you. So Ben, Macron on the guillotine. Pretty exciting, huh?
Well, I can only hope. We need some sort of big victory, and seeing that smug bastard's face when he realizes the game is up would be beautiful. But to change the subject slightly from, cathartic fantasies. It's basically, I think one of the things that you said on this, I think it was on Twitter or Facebook or both probably, about the way that the left approaches protests is really important here. And you said it's basically for the contemporary political moment protests are either Nuremberg, meaning leaning to the extreme far right, or Bastille in terms of the storming of the Winter Palace, the leftist insurrection. So it's either a pure movement or it's a purely evil movement. And I think what we've seen now is that there's sort of two tendencies on the left. There's the sort of remnants of the left who saw pretty much every grouping of people on the streets, regardless of what they were saying, as democracy, as this is how politics is built. And that comes from the anti-globalization movement, it comes from Occupy, and that's still there. And then you also have the sort of reactive left that sees the far right everywhere, even when it's not necessarily there. And that's not to say the far right isn't growing in strength, but it's like everything will naturally lead to them. It's a sort of feeling of powerlessness. So what you have on one side, you have this reaction, which is basically exaggerating our own powers or exaggerating the force of street protests without political organization, and the other, which is like doing it in the other way, in the sense that everything is creeping towards inevitable fascism. But in reality, and this is where I'll shut up, politics is a contested space. And I think as we're seeing in France and we've seen elsewhere, this is a contest between different forces. And because people in many cases often have reactionary ideas, we have to deal with that as a political reality. And this is part of what makes this case so interesting.
Yeah, I think we have to deal with the ambiguity of the moment, and the Gilets jaunes does express the ambiguity of the political moment, where the political left and its traditional organizations are historically weak. There is a neoliberal center which is completely aloof, and then you've got a right which is very opportunistic, and which in some ways, in many cases, have been able to absorb the energy of these broad, inchoate popular protests because they're basically unprincipled. So they'll take on basically anything and will push these protests rightwards. I mean, we've talked about June 2013 in Brazil before and what happened with that. But there's a number of other cases of this sort of broad-based protests, which either tend to be co-opted by the right or will just evaporate because they don't end up coming up with a determinate political and organizational form to carry through those demands. And I guess that sort of left attitude that you described, which, is a legacy of the anti-globalization movement that just has fantasies of insurrection, but without actually building concrete politics, lends itself always to that very evanescent insurrectionary moment. And that's really problematic. As you said, the view from outside has tended to either say that this is the great insurrection moment, it's going to be revolution, and look at it relatively uncritically, or be deeply suspicious. And I think it would be absolutely wrong for your initial reaction to this to be suspicion, because it's unmistakably, as Aurélie put it, it's unmistakably a movement of the people and from below. So to not be at least initially sympathetic to that would be a very wrong first step.
I mean, there's two things to say here. I think in terms of again, this is a scenario that I would not claim any expertise on. So if there's any Korean listeners, feel free to come correct us in a podcast on this because it's super interesting. In terms of the examples of something that didn't take a reactionary direction, remember those mass protests against the South Korean president that ended up in her downfall in terms of after a corruption scandal. Those didn't take a reactionary direction. Why? Because the South Korean working class is not broken. It's one of the strongest trade union movements in the world. And it came in and put order, discipline, and direction, provided a clear political line that channeled this energy, which can often go in reactionary directions, in a direction that saw a more progressive outcome. But I think as we see in France, we see in Brazil, there's no institutions that have that sort of capacity of providing that order right now. That's part of what the crisis of the left is. It's like, who are we articulating ourselves as? Are we articulating ourselves as like this party centered about Mélenchon, as a trade union movement? Who is the force capable of providing that direction? And you clearly see that as a problem. And I also think there's one more point to make, and this is where I'm very suspicious. And I think this is part of what I've been writing about, why the right is so successful at capturing these things. It's not just that they're more opportunistic, it's that there's no symbols of representation. The right does a much better job of using no representation as a form of representation. In essence, like, there's no flag but my country is something the right has managed to do for a variety of reasons. It's something that I think tends to favor the right. On the left, on the other hand, I think, in essence, as much as we talk about direct democracy, has to believe in some idea of representation if we believe in popular projects. And I think that contestation is the right cynically manipulating it, or being able to harness these symbols, and the left struggling to escape its fact that it's actually invested in idea of representation is something we see at the fore of these conflicts.
Yeah, that's right. Because what you have with these protests is the people suddenly jumping on to the national scene, and the right is able to co-opt that or to circumscribe the people as the national people or white people or French people rather than a more universal sense. And so the left has a kind of a harder sell on that regard. And the point you made about representation is really right as well, because there's a contradiction in these demands. I mean, if you look at the list of 42 demands that the gilets jaunes have put out, it's a combination of they do not represent us and we want the government to do X, Y, and Z. So it's partly, state resisting as well as state engaging forms of protest. And that's sort of the ambiguity as well, which would need to be resolved over the course of sort of internal debate within the movement. And that also needs to take place in a specific place and have a determinate kind of democratic forms and processes, rather than just kind of, putting ad hoc discussions on Facebook, which I think is one of the reasons why these sorts of protests are able to explode and gather speed and size so quickly. But it also means that they're limited in terms of actually seeing through any political objectives.
I think I want to end our wonderful podcast with a polemic and a personal tangent against what remains of the horizontalist left. For so long, people were attacked, and they continue to be attacked by the remnants of the autonomists, the anarcho-liberals, or the anarchists for arguing in representation. There's this idea in deliberative democracy, in this idea that democracy is without parties, it's the people directly speaking, it's that spirit of the street. And it's simply a fucking farce. These arguments have failed again and again to prove as strategies to resist the far right or even win victories. In the end, what they lead to is an aesthetic politics in which the form of the protest, the form of the meeting, replaces any substantive political content. And we will see this again and again, that when we're attacked for arguing for representation, because we believe, for instance, that people don't want to spend their whole time in meetings to decide their future, we have to refer back to the fact that the strategies the horizontalist left in terms of resisting the far right has failed again and again, and they have been unable to provide a substantial political alternative. And if the left continues indulging in these fantasies, we're going to be in for an even rougher time.
Very interesting. So I'm personally fascinated to continue observing it, and we can hopefully have Aurélie back on in a little bit's time to discuss what has happened and maybe why Macron fell. All right, that's it for today. We are back with our end of year review towards the end of the month. Catch you later. Bye-bye.